This video is about pinpointing, and you have learned about pinpointing before, but the context in which you learned about pinpointing previously was about clients or students, the behaviors that they engage in. But as you remember, this course is about taking everything you've learned about applied behavior analysis and then applying it to supervision. So instead of pinpointing client behavior, we're going to talk about pinpointing staff behavior. Pinpointing, just as a reminder, pinpointing this video and what you learn about pinpointing in your readings might help you as you write or revise the training objectives for your training project. But it's also just important for the process of supervision. So as a quick reminder, what are pinpoints? Pinpoints are behaviors or outcomes or results. A behavior consists of somebody's actions, but an outcome or result is what is left behind when the behavior has been completed. Measurable. A pinpoint should be measurable, so I should be able to count it, for example. And we can use any measurement system we want, but we should be able to measure the behavior or the result. It should be observable, so it should be that two people can observe the behavior, and it should be reliable. So two independent observers should be able to agree that the behavior has occurred or that it hasn't occurred. A pinpoint should be active. What we mean by active is that it should pass what's called the dead person's test. And if you haven't heard of the dead person's test, yes, this is an actual term in our behavioral field, the dead person's test. So what is it? The dead person's test says it's not a behavior if a dead person could do it. So, for example, can a dead person lay still? Yes. Laying still is not active, and it's not a behavior. It's something that a dead person could do. But in comparison, can a dead person complete progress notes? No. Completing progress notes is active, and it reflects actual behavior. And a final criteria for pinpointing is it's under the performer's control. And what we mean by this is that the performer has to be able to have a major influence on changing the result. Part of the reason this is really important, specifically related to staff, is that as a supervisor, you cannot blame someone for failing to engage in a behavior or failing to produce a result or an outcome, even though there's no reason to believe they should be able to do this. I see this happen most often when supervisors violate our ethics code and assign an activity to a supervisee that they're not qualified to do independently. So those are the things. It has to be a behavior, outcome, or result. It has to be measurable. It has to be observable. It has to be reliable. It has to be active, and it has to be under the performer's control. So I know that you've got a chapter or two this semester in this book, Motivating Human Service Staff by Denny Reed and Marsha Parsons. And they talk a little bit about this too. And they actually go into even more detail. But there were a couple points I really wanted to draw from with that reading. You want to specify the staff performance outcomes that are necessary to produce favorable outcomes for the clients. A lot of times people think that the work that they're being assigned is not relevant, that it's not tied to the client outcomes. And they might be highly motivated to help clients, but they're not highly motivated to do some other things. And so because direct care staff are often asked to perform a broad array of tasks, it's worthwhile to take the time and to connect these specific pinpoints to client outcomes. So the pinpoint by itself is important for measuring, monitoring how your staff are performing, but I think it's also valuable to connect that to why they're there. Because often your direct care staff, if they weren't when they came through the door, most of them eventually feel pretty committed to the clients or the students they serve. So I want to give you a couple of examples. Cleaning toys. A lot of times staff will be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm just always cleaning these toys. I don't see any point in it. Well, if you keep toys clean, then your client's health is going to be better because they're not going to get sick if they're not getting contaminated. And if they're healthier, they're more likely to acquire their skills. Why? They're less likely to miss sessions or days at school. They're more likely to come to school or the center or clinic and be able to pay attention And so we can connect an activity like cleaning toys that we want to pinpoint for the staff to our actual client outcomes. How about progress notes, completing progress notes? Okay, the agent, most people hate doing this paperwork, right? But the agency gets paid for the work that you've already done for the client if you complete this kind of paperwork, completing your progress notes. If the company gets paid, it stays in business. And if it stays in business, your client gets to continue getting services. So even that less pleasant task, this disliked task, can be tied to a purpose. And then the one that's most obvious is implementing interventions with a high degree of treatment integrity. So clients are more likely to benefit from an intervention that has been implemented correctly. But there is another piece that I want to add to that. If you implement an intervention and it's not done with a high degree of accuracy and the treatment looks like it's not effective, you don't know whether the client would have benefited from that treatment or not. Like, you can't get rid of the treatment until you know it's been implemented accurately. I want to know as quickly as possible if a treatment really isn't going to work, because once I know that, then I know how I can tweak the intervention or how I can, if I need to switch to another intervention altogether. All right, before we close, I want to just give you a couple examples of poor and good pinpoints. So as a supervisor, these skills that you develop in pinpointing with your clients, you're going to want to use them, the ones that you use for writing good behavioral objectives for clients, you're going to want to apply the same skills to writing good pinpoints for your staff. I think one of the biggest keys, like we identified all of them, but the place that I see the most frequent errors is that they're not clear enough that two observers could reliably draw the same conclusion based on whether the behavior occurred or it didn't occur. So I'm going to give you a couple for staff behavior that I have seen people write up and that they're just not specific enough. Some won't surprise you, some of them probably might. A bad attitude. Okay, this person has a bad attitude. They need to improve their attitude. Well, this is not a good pinpoint because two observers are not going to necessarily agree. Instead, a better pinpoint, what would be the things that the behaviors are associated with what you think of as a bad attitude. So for example, one of them is whether or not somebody shows up on time for work. It's like people will say this person has a bad attitude. They don't even get here on time. And then that's what they're attributing to a bad attitude. And it might not have anything to do with a bad attitude. Another example where people might disagree, for example, I play devil's advocate all the time. I'm always the one to challenge the status quo, whatever's going on. I'm going to go, now wait a minute, let's look at it this way, or let's look at it from this other person's perspective. Now I see that as a sign of my absolute commitment to what I do. But other people might see that as a bad attitude. And so you have to be really specific, because one person would observe my behavior and say, oh, she's got a bad attitude. And somebody else would be like, oh my gosh, she's so passionate about what she does. And so you have to be very specific enough that two independent observers would draw the same conclusion about whether the behavior occurred or not. A couple more examples. Poor communication. This is when you see people say all the time for staff. Okay, it's not a good pinpoint because, again, we might not agree about what poor communication is. And so I might be as specific as the staff member informs their supervisor when supplies drop to 20% of those needed. And I might list out a handful of areas where I want specific behaviors to be demonstrated to improve their communication. So the idea of communication is not a bad one. It's just that you have to pinpoint it so that we know exactly what behaviors we're looking for. And the last one that I'm going to tell you is theft. And that one might seem like totally obvious. But here's an example where two people might disagree. Have you ever checked your personal email or checked your phone for text or social media while you were at the workplace? A lot of people do this. Well, you might be thinking theft means somebody stole money, but somebody else might look at that behavior and say, well, you stole because you actually did steal something. You were getting paid for work and you didn't engage in that work, and instead you were doing something that you wanted. And so they would call that theft. So that's one to me that I just look at and say, yeah, this is one that people would just assume everyone would agree. but not necessarily. So the more specific we can be so that two observers can reliably agree that the behavior either has occurred or has not occurred, the better the pinpoint.